Um, Hello, everyone. Welcome. Thank you so much for having me here. If we could have the slides on the screen. I am Eva Franch Gilabert, and I'm here today, actually, speaking through two roles, kind of different roles. Definitely not about the stress on the city. That is one of our other speakers. So we could actually go into the next slide. This is Professor Mazda Adli, that I believe is going to talk later, I believe. So I'm going to keep on talking until I see my slides up there. I'm here speaking not only as an architect, but as someone who has actually been directing an institution for the last 8 years that tries to think of the future, the topic of this panel, through a very different perspective. We just heard Richard actually talking about the importance of alternative institutions, of non-for-profit institutions, of educational institutions that are able to think the future. So how does one think the future? A word that, in fact, we have heard so many times. And as I just mentioned, I've been investigating over the last 8 years at the Storefront for Art and Architecture. And in the next future, in my own future, I'm going to be investigating at the Architectural Association School of Architecture in London. The future. Well, the future is a word that has been gaining some traction, that we have been using a bit more, and yet we could see that in the last few years it has stabilized. It has arrived a kind of a moment in which maybe we are tired. Maybe we have used it too much. Maybe we don't even know what we mean by that future. And 3D, that is the other word for this fantastic panel. We can see that, yes, that idea of 3D goes really up. But what about 4D? And what about 2D or 5D, when we actually start adding more dimensions, not only the spatial ones? It's interesting to see in this diagram that around the mid-80s, the 5D, when actually we were not bringing only space, and if you want, the three-dimensional aspects of the city into that conversation, but other dimensions. And I'm going to talk about other dimensions or other issues. What are the issues of the future? What are those dimensions that we should be talking about? What are the architectures? What are the things that we should be focusing on? Over the last few years, I've been looking into the built environment, into the good, the bad, and the ugly, as a way to identify what are the issues that we have not been addressing, that we should have. What are the ideas behind ideas of culture or capital? What is the idea that labor, as we heard before, is not being understood as a space of creative action? How can we think the future of the city through many different issues that actually have to try to house that idea of public good? So, trying to understand how do we actually look into the future, one might have to wonder and ask, well, what is this architect of the future? And so as someone who actually now is invested fully in educating architects or trying to understand what that means, one might think that maybe this is the figure of the architect, the genius staying in his studio, sitting down surrounded by some apprentices, trying to figure out that feature, that sketch, that genius moment. Sometimes the room has more geniuses, most of the times historically, men. Wonderful. White, sometimes, obviously not. But so what happens when we start diversifying that space, that factory of architecture that we have inherited? To change the future, maybe we also need to start thinking how do we change our modes of production or forms of collaboration. So I'm not only interested in firms and architecture as a space of brand, identities as names, like one could say as SOM, as Bernard Tschumi architects, or as DSR, the architects of the park here that we are actually occupying, but in fact I'm interested in something other, in something that looks more like this. What is that collective space? What is that future that we are all collectively building? What if suddenly we would take ownership and authorship, not only of the things we do, but those ones that actually our neighbor does? Because in fact we are responsible. We are the authors by omission or by action. So trying to understand those kind of diagrams, those spaces, those organizations that makes us work, relate, make decisions, something that I'm interested. More than those kind of hierarchical structures, what happens when we are all complicit of this space of production? And so from the forms of practice to the scales of practice, what is the scale of the future when we actually looking into the world through those digital screens that we are scrolling up and down? What are those aesthetics of the future? And of course, we might think that that's the 2D or the 3D that the future looks like. But we are really interested in understanding what are the forms, what are the spaces that makes us feel, that makes us think differently. And what are the politics of the future? Where are those spaces of resistance? What are those spaces of radical transformation when the world is constantly dealing not only with auditoriums like this one, but with platforms and spaces like that one? It is important to actually think, how do we bring in the same room, as here we have the head of infrastructure of the city of Santo Domingo together with a woman who has no electricity sitting on the same panel discussion table. Who is sitting in this room? Who am I speaking to? That's always a question. But so this ethics of the future is one that I think we are constantly trying to debate, and oftentimes we forget because of issues of aesthetics, because of issues of power. How do we open that sky, that curtain, and try to start thinking about the different challenges, the different forces of the politics of today, the ecologies that are surrounding us, and what are those tools that we want to bring into that future? Many of the conversations around this conference have to do with smart cities, with how we actually measure things. How many people are in this room? Do we have enough people? Is it full? Are 3 of you enough to actually make this conversation a relevant one, a one that is going to change some things? Well, smile. We are all being measured constantly. The question is, for what? For whose intelligence? For whose understanding? What is the scale that we are trying to enact and to produce? I do think that when we talk, obviously, about many of these issues that we have addressed over and over, we really always need to end up with a question mark. Smarts for who? And of course, never to forget the economics of that future, and the economics that we are surrounded with. Who supports, who finances, and what are the politics embedded within that? We're going to talk a bit about museums and culture in a panel following this one, and try to understand what is that actually drives culture, and cultural capital, and cultural production, and how do we, as architects, are able to feel comfortable or not with certain sources of economic power. How do we produce new economic features? This is something that obviously is part of that design. So who is this inhabitant of the future, the children, the aging population, and at the same time, what is that we are going to remember? Over the last 8 years, we have been asking these kind of questions. What is that souvenir that we should have of a city? What is that image of a city embodies and represents? In New York City, we all have seen that little souvenir of the Statue of Liberty. Many of you might not know what SCABI means and represents. I encourage you to look at it. What are the small moments that construct not only your future, but our memory and the path of that future? Sometimes through the small object of a souvenir. So this city of the future is one that I'm trying to constantly ask, yeah, how do we design it? And then you always end up saying, well, who has the power? Who has the power of changing that city? Who has the power of really transforming that city? And asking that question, I realized that one can actually only use probably politics, and at the same time, poetics. Architecture is always very slow. It takes years to make anything, to accomplish anything. Art somehow is very fast, always timely. It really gets there almost insultingly, the right question in the right time. But somehow poetry is the only one who can get us early, if you want. So I was very interested in trying to bring poetics and politics together, and I realized that to actually ask all those questions was one way of thinking about the future, but the best way to think about the future was to get the architects together and to talk to this guy, the guy who actually holds a lot of power, the mayor. So we started a project back in 2014 in New York City when Bill de Blasio was elected, in which we asked 50 architects to write a letter to the mayor. Mostly because he actually said that architects most of the time stand by the sides of power, developers, luxury, tourism, but never by the social project that one should be building. And of course, one might agree that he was kind of right, but it is also true that architects, we do stand and we do represent those ones who cannot and are not able to sit at the decision-making table. So this project that started in 2014, asking 50 architects to write this letter to the mayor of New York, actually traveled to more than 20 cities, and it is still an ongoing project, that what it does, it actually brings architects and the architecture community together to figure out how do we envision that future, how do we denounce, how do we enable, and how do we project certain ideas, not in relationship to our own projects, to our own firms, to that lost competition, but in fact to a future vision of that city that we do share. So the project, of course, tried to not only bring the architects together in front of the mayor. This is in the middle Manuela Carmena, the mayor of Madrid, who responded to each one of the 80 letters that she received one by one and hosted a symposium addressing some of the issues that the architects raised. But what it does, it also brings citizens closer to the architect. What has happened over the many years of architecture as a kind of a star architect system, as a space of iconoclast design, is that in fact the architect has not been seen or perceived as the one who has the privilege, but also the responsibility to articulate the social, the political, and the economic, and to try to, again, speak on behalf of those ones who cannot sit at the table. So the project, bringing architects together, architects with citizens and architects next to politics, has, through these letters, a very simple act. The writing of a letter, start to actually produce a transversal understanding of how do we think about cities today. So looking through each one of the cities and each one of those conversations and each one of those forums that have been actually doing the same, that is to articulate the problems, the desires, and the solutions of many of the cities that we actually know, that look as referential spaces that try to learn from. And so how do we produce a parliament in which actually is not only about one broadcasting in this direction, but actually a parliament in which each one of us is writing to a particular form of power. So this project that was pretty successful in its answering of this question, who has power, made me think that, yes, of course, mayors have power. They are elected every 4 years in most cities around the world. But made me ask, okay, who has more power? And of course, who has more power? It's very easy. One can start really clearly understanding that the real estate, the developers, the private holders of land are the ones who actually have more power. So in trying to address them, then we did the following. Letters to the developer. So we asked a group of architects to actually write a letter. And while the letters to the mayor sometimes are critical, the letters to the developer are always love letters. Mostly because, as you probably know, usually developers, they don't take criticism very well, right? They like to be praised. They like to actually be said that they are fantastic. So we said, could you please write a letter that recognizes a developer for the production of the common good that goes beyond common practice and should become part of the norm? And what was fantastic about that kind of gesture is that it forced people to really try to identify what is that even people within the highest structures or forms of like capital production are able to do something good. And guess what? The day before we opened the show, we received a call from a developer asking if he actually was part of the exhibition. The desire of being part, of being recognized for doing something good. So how do we produce small projects that are able to reflect, to make us think about what is that is happening when new buildings, when this idea of progress, where those new fantastic architectures appear in front of us, sorry, what do they represent? What do they stand for? What is the value? What is the transaction that each one of these buildings stands for? For who are they? How are we actually able to house different voices? Of course, as the project developed, we said maybe we should even go there, but we didn't, so do not worry. And so what was interesting about this question of who has more power is that, in fact, we realized that through these letters, what we realized that the most important thing to us was not only what is the problem, but also what is the question. And so a few years ago, we started and we produced this project that actually asks what is that is architecturally urgent. Sometimes as architects, we participate in competitions, answering questions that someone else has asked. Answering a question that sometimes a politician that looks into another city wants to actually just imitate or replicate another effect. We can call it the Bilbao effect, we can call it the High Line effect, we can call it any effect. And so the question here is, can we start thinking what are the urgencies and what are the spaces of discussion that we should produce? But so it is known to everyone that competitions are problematic. in many ways, how they're organized, their transparency, their forms of action, but all from the questions to the jury. There are a lot of things that need to be rethought, but as a method of democratizing the opportunity to be part of the building of society is a very important one. So this competition, that was the competition of competitions, asked people to write briefs, asked people to actually articulate for their cities, for their territories, what is that they thought that was important to be asked, and who should be asking, and who should be in the jury, and what would be the financial conditions, and what would be the evaluation guidelines, and how do we produce fair structures. The answers were multiple, some of them speculative, some of them fictional. But what was more interesting is that from all the ones that we received, the jury decided to choose one that actually made us think and reflect even further. So the competition of competitions of competitions, that was the winning entry of that first edition, actually asked us to expand the architectural protocol by thinking, what are the buildings that we should be taking down? So what is that future that we are seeing is not one that is being built, but also one that is being erased, and also one that actually is being dismantled, but also one that is being recycled. And so in this space of trying to understand how do we take buildings down, this competition produced a very interesting set of answers that I'm not going to go there. But so, what future do we want? It is true that over the last, let's say, decade, we have experienced a digital revolution. One could say that every single revolution through the history of humanity has consisted in bringing larger amounts of people together. The sharing movement, if you want, enacted by the different digital tools that we do have, has really changed the way in which we live, the way in which we inhabit cities. We move, we go home, we spend time in hotels or in homes of other people that we never met. And so the question here is that architects, we have arrived a bit late to that revolution. So what I'm interested in asking, what if we would take that kind of new predisposition, that new technological condition, and we would actually start thinking and rethinking the city as architects through the sharing movement. So this is what we did at the Storefront back in 2015. And we asked, and we took Manhattan and we sliced it, we shared it, and we asked architects to envision that future, that sharing movement, that sharing future city, trying to think about many of the conditions that would make it possible. And so, how do we think about the future, but also how do we think about this past future? One of my obsessions has been that, in fact, the future has written already yesterday. There are so many futures that we left on the way of progress, that we left on the way of business models. And I'm very interested in idea models. So back in the 2000s, we started looking, 2012, into the project of past futures, present futures. What are the unrealized projects in New York City that we should actually look back to actually see if there was any validity in actually projecting them into our future? And so asking each one of those architects to project into this future, we produced a space in which the future was almost invisible as a way to make us reflect, but at the same time to make us really understand that that future is always constructed somehow yesterday. And so finishing here, I'm just going to finish with my future, that is obviously trying to understand how do we as architects participate in the construction of that sphere, of that blue space. And the truth that, in fact, there is design, there are ideas in every single space of this world. The Architectural Association, the institution that I'm actually being part of, it's a place that constantly produces those vectors of desire, the spaces of reflection and those spaces of understanding about what is that drives us. The idea of making sure that we understand what is that we care for. How do we keep this multiplicity of origins, of languages, as part of our own agendas? How do we understand the rigor and madness that the life that we want to share, the life that we all actually live, can be producing much more interesting future than the one that we constantly face, is something that I've been looking at, that we're going to be looking at, and that I hope that you join me in the next few months, years, hopefully, in London as we explore many of these past futures, but also many of the redefinitions of the future ahead of us. Not only, obviously, through projects and students, but through publications, and many of the other ways in which ideas are transmitted. 10 minutes has never been enough to talk about the future, probably nor today. But what is great about this is that suddenly, this building that doesn't look like any future, I promise you it's going to be filled with them. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for impression and wonderful presentation. And I have questions about terms that you say about digital revolution, digital transformations. Now many people live in virtual world more than in reality. And so what do you think, how to make an offline communication in an urban environment preferable than online communications? How to return people to cities from virtual world?
Well, the way in which we are able to make people lose their phones, right? And simply engage with each other. How does one produce a space of engagement? I can tell you a bar is a great solution. And I'm saying a bar because there are basic needs of engagement. One of the most important spaces within the Architectural Association, a School of Architecture, is the bar, where people actually go there to engage with each other, to talk and to discuss. Part of these conferences, the most important conversations are not happening here, are happening in the corridor, in those interstitial spaces that are designed to produce a space of, if you want, of familiarity, of proximity. So I do think that as architects we have a bigger challenge about how do we actually produce a space of resistance, but also new spaces of desire. And I think we should not go away from the fact that it's not only, this is a very intermediate state that we are actually engaging with a device and then abandoning the world. I look forward to our mixed reality in which I'm going to be actually looking at you and being able to see many of the other things that the information society is able to provide. And the same when we engage with cities. So I don't think that this dichotomy that we are now suffering, if you want, is going to be real as we actually move forward. I think we are very close to be able to have a space of presence and mindfulness, and at the same time of digital support and radical technology embedded within our daily life.
Thank you. Thank you for impression presentation, and welcome to Moscow next time and next time. Thank you.
Thank you.
And now I'm glad to invite to next presentation Mazda Adli, chair of Fliedner Klinik, Berlin, and author of books Stress and the City. Welcome.
Well, good evening, everyone. Luckily, you're already familiar with the first slide from which has been shown in my previous speaker's talk. Well, I'm a psychiatrist and a stress researcher, and I deal with cities. Starting by the question, if city living drives us crazy? And the answer is yes, in a way, they do drive us crazy. Although they mean freedom and individual development for many of us, probably for most of us here, cities are positive stimulators for our development, for our education and our personal well-being. But our brains do not seem to be optimally designed for living in the densely populated metropolises of our world. It's quite plausible to all of us that city living means an increase in stress exposure, and it also doesn't need many explanations to understand that stress is something that affects our health and affects our well-being. Yet and however, urban populations do live under improved conditions. They have better access to healthcare, better access to wealth, better access to education, sanitation, and so on. It's an ambivalent situation with the cities. City living, for example, is known to be a risk factor for some major psychiatric diseases. The risk for schizophrenia, for example, as depicted here in this study, is twice as high for people living in cities, and for those who have grown up in cities. Then it even comes with a dose-response relationship for the size of the city, someone has grown up in, and for the amount of time that someone has grown up in the city. The larger the city, the larger the city, the higher your schizophrenia risk later as an adult. And it even has been published a while ago that city living is a risk factor with a similar effect size as cannabis consumption in individuals with a genetic risk profile for schizophrenia. It has also been shown for depression that the risk for suffering from depression is 1.5-fold increased in city dwellers, also for anxiety disorders. These effects even remain stable after controlling for other statistical confounders, other risk factors for these diseases, which indicates that the risk increase to suffer from a psychiatric disease as an urban dweller is only partly explained by population characteristics. And this again is important evidence pointing toward the causation hypothesis that states that urbanicity per se increases the risk for mental ill health, as opposed to the selection hypothesis, which states that high-risk individuals rather seek urban environments, for example, because they hope for better health care. But that does still not mean that city living is harmful per se for our mental health. It rather means that living urban or not interacts with our brains and with other risk factors, such as genetic, psychological, or social risk factors. And why is this important? It's important because the global population living in cities is growing dramatically, and I would even say that urbanization is the essential change that mankind is facing within the next decades, with probably a comparable health effect as climate change has on us. You might be familiar to these figures. In 1950, a third of the world's population lived in cities. Today, we're slightly above the 50% crossing, and in 2050, about 2/3 of the global population will live in urban environments. Of course, the big cities of our world grow at different paces. Berlin, where I live, is of course definitely not Shanghai, and it's definitely not Istanbul or Mumbai. But if we look at larger geographical units, we can see that urbanization is going on everywhere in all parts of the world. For Moscow and for Russia, we find the situation as in probably most of the industrialized countries of the global north, while the total population of the country is decreasing, is going down, the urban population is growing and going up. Now, how is urbanization connected to stress for the individual? Is there anything like city-specific stress? And if yes, how does that get under the skin? Now, in our research, we follow a social stress hypothesis, which states that it is the simultaneity of social density on the one hand and social isolation on the other hand, which converge to health-relevant social stress. It has been shown for both stressors separately that they are health relevant. Social density, for example, can mean a constant threat for the social order we live in. Overcrowding can induce stress-related illnesses in all kinds of species, ranging from insects to rodents to primates, including us humans. And social isolation, at the same time, is associated with excess mortality and is presented as is presented in this meta-analysis here. A meta-analysis, by the way, is a statistical analysis which adds the data of many single studies. Here there are more than 300,000 participants included, and we see that social isolation causes more premature mortality than obesity, than alcohol consumption, or even smoking. So, is it increased stress exposure in crowded urban environments that drives us crazy when the environment becomes less controllable for the individual? A study from Germany nicely contributed to understanding social stress as the significant mediator. The authors used functional magnetic resonance imaging to investigate the specific human brain areas that might be affected by urban living. Participants here lived or had lived in rural areas, in small towns, or in large cities. And the authors measured regional brain activation while the participants performed a social stress test. And this test meant solving hard arithmetic problems, mathematical problems, in front under time pressure, in front of an audience that continuously gave negative feedback. This is serious social stress. And what did the authors found? Well, of the activated brain regions, 2 were of particular interest, which are very important in the context of processing emotions and stress. Here, for example, we see the amygdala, where environmental threat and negative emotions are processed. Activity in this area correlated with the size of the city an individual currently resided. And there was another brain area, the anterior cingulate cortex, which I do not show here for time reasons. Here the activity correlated with the amount of time the participant had grown up in a city during his childhood. And this again is interesting against the converging evidence that adverse conditions early in life can severely impact the developing brain and persistently increase vulnerability, for example, for depression later in life. The problem seems to arise where urban stressors, yet to be defined what that exactly is, converge with other risk factors for psychiatric diseases. Such a risk factor can be a socio-demographic factor like old age or having a migrant status, for example, both of which might set you at increased risk for social exclusion and social isolation. A study recently done by colleagues from our department revealed that for migrants with Turkish background living in Berlin, it is primarily the poverty around them, the poverty of their neighbors, which put them at risk for developing psychopathological symptoms. As you see here, the higher the column in the specific city area, the more severe are the mental health problems, and the darker the color, the higher the poverty of the neighborhood. So it is rather the misery of the people surrounding us that seem to drive us mad rather than our own misery. Now, I'm coming to my final remarks. What is the consequence? First of all, there's still a lot of unsolved questions. But first of all, the readout of this and other studies does not suggest that mega cities or large cities per se cause mental problems. We should be aware of that. But it shows that city living affects the stress-associated processing of our emotions, and that can have a health impact on individuals that carry an increased risk for mental diseases, such as a genetic risk or social risk, for example. We urgently need to know more about these individual differences in the context of city living. We need to identify the at-risk populations for social isolation, for example, like people with a migrant background or elderly people and so on. And we do need more information about the specifics of the health-threatening stressors and by which means they may translate into brain disorders. And certainly we need further research on the long-term effects of urban stressors on the developing brain and during childhood, and which living conditions may put our kids particularly at risk. And last but not least, we need to increase our understanding about the stress protective factors of city living, the elements which form the basis of what we call the urban advantage, which means the gift of living under conditions of cultural and social diversity in cities with easy access to education, wealth, and good health care. Therefore, we need to better understand how the built and the social environment of the city can affect our behavior, can stimulate participation and adoption of public space in the urban habitat. A nice example of a study which shows how the urban environment can actually influence people's behavior is here, a study from Baltimore, which showed that the density of the tree canopies in streets and in public places actually increased the social cooperation of the people living underneath these trees. The social cohesion, the social capital of the people underneath those very dense trees was actually higher than in other areas with low leaf density of the trees. Now, what are now immediate action, on the action side, immediate action points? What can we do now? Firstly, a consequence out of the social stress hypothesis is that we need to minimize the experience of uncontrollable density for the individual, and at the same time we need to prevent and minimize social isolation, particularly in high-risk individuals, for exclusion and isolation. And for example, an important function comes with public spaces. Public spaces bring people together. Public spaces induce social interaction for urban dwellers and protect us against social isolation. And what we need, and we urgently need, is the public mental health strategies for our cities. If it's true that urbanization is going on rapidly, and if it's true that the risk for suffering from schizophrenia is twice as high for urban dwellers, then it is about high time to develop such a mental health strategies for our cities. And this is why we have proposed why I've proposed the term neurourbanism in this context. By neurourbanism, I mean an exchange between urban planning on the one hand and architecture, social sciences on the one hand, and psychiatry, psychology, and neurosciences on the one hand. We have formed such a working group in Berlin, people working together from different disciplines to develop such an approach, such a charta of neurourbanism, recommendations for urban planners, for city governments to shape cities that prevent our mental health and prevent social stress in urban environments. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you for interesting and very useful presentation. And one short questions. Big city and loneliness. How can you get away from this typical problem in the future, and how we need to redevelop city environment to help people to move away from loneliness?
Well, what we need is public space. Public space protects us from loneliness because it brings people together. We need a cultural and age-sensitive stimulation for urban dwellers to step out of their doors, because time spent in front of your doorstep is time which protects you against social isolation. So we need an effective stimulation for people to walk out of their doors. For example, by shaping walkable environments, neighborhoods which provide an infrastructure which can easily be accessed even by people with mobility problems, such as the older ones. And also our cultural locations, like theaters, for example, are part of the public space which protects us from social isolation, because they increase social interaction and cohesion in the urban population.
Thank you so much. And thank you. I want to invite for next presentation Stephen Yarwood, urban futurist and ex-Lord Mayor from Adelaide.
Last presentation for the day, but I want to particularly say thank you for the city government for hosting me. I'm the only Australian at the conference. It's been a wonderful experience to be here, and I've learned a tremendous amount. So I was the Lord Mayor of Adelaide, but I'm also an urban planner, but I've always been passionate about the future of cities. And so I started a journey of exploring this notion of City 2050. And I did this because I was very concerned that our leaders of our cities, our states and our nations were applying what they knew about cities to plan a future that looks nothing like that. It's like looking in a rear vision mirror to drive forwards. And in particular, that's a good example because when you look in the rear vision mirror of a car, all you see is cars, and there will not be cars in our urban future. I put this slide up because this is the type of three-dimensional city that architects draw pictures of when they've got no work on. And this is, for me, a really bad example of what the future of cities can look like. This is the three-dimensional city where the shop, the childcare centre, the entertainment, all the facilities are contained in single buildings. And if you look at this picture, you can't see people on the streets. You can't see people interacting with each other. It's a very sterile environment. And so instead of today exploring the three-dimensional city, I wanted to discuss the fourth dimension of cities, because I think that the future of cities is not going to be the physical design of the cities, but it's going to be the operation of cities. And that fourth dimension is time. And we need to understand that cities have actually been always evolving and will continue to evolve, and that there are critical points in time where cities have dramatically changed. So let's go back 2 million years. This is when humans became into existence, and these dots are humans. This is hunter-gatherer. It's trying different foods. Some people tried the food that killed them. Some people tried the food that made them stronger. That's called natural selection. And we wandered the earth randomly as human beings. Then about 12,000 years ago, humans discovered agriculture. They started to gather in small spaces and create small collective communities. Then about 400 BC, we had the invention of cities. If there are any Greek people in the room, Hippodamus was the first town planner. He was one of my heroes, and we started to gather in communities and create cities about 400 BC. Then in about 1760, we had the Industrial Revolution, and that started to change, well, that dramatically changed the shape of our cities, how cities worked, how cities people connected and gathered, and how cities started to grow much more rapidly. And of course now, in 2018, we've got this notion that city planners, mayors, architects, designers, governance people have created these urban environments. We control the city. We make the city, we give the city to the people, and we tell the people how they're meant to use our cities. And these are the sorts of shapes that we've created today. And the moral of that story is that it's always been some type of technology that has defined the spatial dynamics of cities. Does anyone want to tell me that the car did not define the spatial dynamics of cities in the 20th century? It fundamentally determined how our cities worked. Interestingly enough, that was in 1908. Of course, 100 years later, we're now looking at the smartphone. Now, we've heard a lot about smart cities at this conference, and I've put this diagram up just to demonstrate the incredible range of smart cities things that we can and should explore. But I'm a little bit cynical about smart cities, and this is a good example because there's one really important thing missing on this diagram, and that's people. And of course, people make cities, and we must put the smart citizen at the centre of the smart cities conversation. And so the people are what makes cities, and I use this diagram to represent the citizen of today. We've all got smartphones. We use them to integrate and navigate not only with the city but each other, our economy, and virtually everything that we do today. So this represents the citizen of today. But we are now moving to the citizen of the future. And the conversation that futurists are having is, just as we've gone post-paper, we will soon go post-smartphone. Technology is going to become increasingly ubiquitous. Just as we have Wi-Fi around us, technology and the way we use it will become increasingly invisible. And I love the term watch, because instead of it being a time device, it will be something that watches everything we do. Our heart rate, our friends, our activities, our diaries, how we move through cities, what we purchase, and how we actually integrate with a whole range of elements of the city, the economy, the society, etc. Now, where is all of this going? This is a graph that's just meant to represent the dramatic increase in the way we talk about technology. It's easy to understand the past. It's much harder to understand the future. But the key to this graph is the curve that goes up and up and up. And it's about a conversation that we don't have in cities enough. We have it in the technology industry. We have it in a whole range of other industries. But the word singularity is something that we need to understand when it comes to the operating system of cities. And singularity is this notion that artificial superintelligence will abruptly trigger a runaway technological growth, resulting in unfathomable changes to human civilization. Now, I've put Singularity 2045 up there because the commentators are now saying that this is when computers will become more intelligent than every single person in this room, and then they will be able to invent a computer that's twice as smart as itself, and then that computer will be able to invent a computer that's twice as smart as itself. And looking around the room, I can't see anyone over the age of 30, so this is all going to be in your lifetime. What does that mean? Well, it means that by about the year 2040, your phone or your watch is going to be smarter than you are. I have a 9-year-old son. By the time he finishes university, his phone will be smarter than him, or at least cloud connected to a computer that will be more intelligent or more powerfully than you are. As a futurist, it's worth pointing out that if you live to the age, to the year 2045, you may well be able to download your consciousness onto a machine and technically get uploaded into a new organic body and live forever. And this is coming. So, artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence is about learning, it's about finding patterns, it's about predictions, it's about adaptations, and it's about recommendations. It's about understanding complex systems. Now, if cities aren't the most exquisite, complex systems and patterns that humans have ever created, I don't know what is. And it's really sad that we tend to have conversations around artificial intelligence in our phones, in our banks, in our industries, in commercial environments, but we're not having a conversation around what it fundamentally means for the operating system of cities. What we're going to see in the very near future is artificial intelligence being embedded in our entire smart citizen ecosystem. It will be in our homes. It will be on the streets of our cities. It will be in how we move through cities. It's going to be the essence of our economy, and it's also going to be involved with all of our stuff. Who I share it with, how I share it with, when I share it, what I charge for it, what I pay for it. But more importantly, it's also going to be embedded in our mind. I have a friend who already has a hearing aid, and he has a device that he wears. When his phone rings, he presses a button, and the hearing aid in his ear actually is his phone. Now, we're going to get to the point very soon where we will always have the potential to have those voices in our head. I'm not going to be the only person with voices in my head. I'm looking forward to that day. So what does this really mean? I don't have the answers, but what I'd like to do is ask the questions. So firstly, technology is going to create a fundamentally new urban operating system. Cities are going to work in completely different ways that we don't yet understand. Yet we apply today's thinking to plan a future and spend billions of dollars on infrastructure that may not be relevant in the very near future. And so I put this up because I saw Bill Clinton speak once about ants, and it was a real inspiration. I don't know if you know, but the biomass of ants is more than humans put together across the planet. Interestingly, with ants, there is no mare ant. There is no queen ant or king ant. There is no ant that is in control. Ants have a completely flat neural chemical system where they communicate with each other and work, and they build bigger and more impressive cities for their scale than humans are doing today. But they do it through a neural network of information that is completely flat. And so I can't help but wonder whether the technology that's going to be embedded into our systems, into our ears, into our watches, into our homes, etc., is going to see a fundamental new leap. So we talked about agriculture, we talked about the Industrial Revolution, I've talked about where we're at today. This is going to be a huge leap to how cities work, how citizens connect with each other, how citizens connect with built form, how citizens move through environments, how they also use the economy as well. So we're getting to the point where we are going to see a massive change. I describe it as the next global warming. This is a tsunami that is going to hit us in the next few years. It's a term I use, information ecology. It's going to be where information not only changes how people work, but actually influences ecological systems themselves. And so just to sort of wrap this up, this new operating system is going to change the DMA of cities. Now, DMA is a take on DNA, but it's a wonderful term for urbanists and planners to use to articulate to citizens, because it's not until citizens start doing things differently that we're actually doing a good job. So DMA, D for density. This is going to change the density of cities. People are going to choose to live in higher, more dense environments if they've got the neural network and the tools to start connecting in different ways. Mix, it's going to start to change. If we can think out aloud in our home about products we want to buy, and an artificial intelligence will not only determine what we want, how we want it, but how it's going to get to us, a whole range of land uses in our cities are going to disappear. A friend of mine has the first law firm without lawyers. Do we always need to go to a doctor if we can get some good advice at home? What is going to happen to all of these land uses that we assume are going to be here today in the future that may not even be relevant? And then finally, access. Access is going to change. So DMA, density, mix, and access, a wonderful way of speaking to non-urbanists about how cities work. And I just wanted to give you one very brief, crazy idea. As a futurist, if I don't say something crazy, I'm not doing my job right. And this is just an example of how it might change. So this is the street of today. We've got a footpath. Hopefully we've got a bicycle lane. Then we've got a car lane. Then hopefully we've got a bus lane. Hopefully the car speed is 40 kilometres an hour, because cars should never go over 40 kilometres an hour in a highly dense environment. It makes it much more stressful. But that's how we think about public space at the moment. But where does this device belong on that? Where's this type of transport belong in that space? Where is this type and that type? The problem is, at the moment, we are banning alternative transport options because it doesn't fit the paradigm of walking, cycling, or using public transport or a car. But if we rethink how we use cities and start to look at a range of autonomous vehicles, including this type of technology, we may be able to rethink fundamentally public space. So in this environment, do you remember as a child your parents telling you to walk on the right-hand side of the footpath? Do you remember? The older people in the room remember. The young people don't know. They just look at their phones and walk right in the middle, and you have to kind of walk around them. But if we rethink, in Australia, of course, my mother told me to walk on the left-hand side of the footpath. If we rethink how we are geospatially connected to the curvature of the Earth, and we think about all of these different types of technologies that we want in our cities as alternatives to using cars, maybe, just maybe, this could be the 5 kilometre an hour zone instead of the footpath. The next lane might be the 10 kilometre an hour zone. The next lane might be the 20 kilometre an hour zone. So instead of thinking about public space as for pedestrians, instead of thinking about public space as being a car-only space, we can start to think about how we move people through cities using a range of different technologies. I've seen even in this park, scooters are banned. I've seen in Taipei that they're getting rid of electric-assisted bicycles because they get in the way of the motorcycles. At the moment, we're stuck in today and not creating a future that we want to see. So the very simple premise that I'm trying to put forward here is that once again, it's very easy to understand yesterday, but we don't really understand what's coming in the future. Make no mistake, we are on the cusp of a transformational change in how smart citizens interact with cities, how smart citizens interact with the economy, and how smart citizens interact with each other. And I'd really encourage you to think about how we plan for that future. We don't have the answers, but I think it's really important that we ask the right questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for that great futuristic view. It's very important for Russia because we only start the discussion about exponential future. And my question is, what do you think? How we can start communicate between communities, between business, between developers, between city administration? How we can start discussion about future, not only about mindset and pictures future, but about rules, about steps to create new cities, new environment, and new communication platform. What first step we need to do?
Well, I believe it's very important to connect today with tomorrow. And so seeing change on the streets of a city today is very important, but articulating an aspirational, transformational future is very important. One thing that I think I haven't heard at this conference, and certainly we're not having the conversation in Australia, but China, India, Scandinavia, I believe Germany, have all publicly stated that they will ban the internal combustion engine car from their countries by 2040. So what I would suggest is that Moscow needs to set a goal as to when it will get rid of the car. It needs to state it, it needs to articulate it, and it needs to encourage citizens to be the change that they want to see in the city, because the difficulty I've had is that we as urbanists will say we don't want cars in our city, but our citizens are addicted to these vehicles. And if we tell them that we shouldn't have them, they'll get angry at us. But if we tell them they're going to go, they'll understand that it's inevitable and they'll start to think differently. So be bold, have a vision, articulate it from schools to universities to public spaces, and I would call on the city of Moscow to set a date to get rid of the internal combustion car as an example.
Thank you.
Thank you. Cheers.
Thanks a lot for all our great speakers today, and we finished our sessions. Thanks a lot. Спасибо всем за внимание. Мы завершаем нашу сессию. И большое спасибо всем нашим спикерам. Всего хорошего.